Good afternoon. Welcome to what proves to be one of the most interesting sessions in KLF 2017. I, as a student of literature, grew up on a staple diet of Shashi Tharoor. I've been teaching him, I've also been reading him for a long time. We have celebrated 25 years of the great Indian novel. In a sense, it radically revolutionized the way we thought of our mythology. I think Shashi Tharoor has made significant contributions to the genre of writing that we call Indian writing in English. Seminal contributions. Today, along with Shashi Tharoor, we also have Kanishk Tharoor. When I read him last week, I thought that he does not require the legacy of a name, Tharoor. He can stand up on his own feet. The book was very, very interesting. In fact, I fell in love with the book at the first glance. I remember more than 2 decades back, I fell in love with the great Indian novel. And today, I have the fortune of falling in love again with the Swimmer Among the Stars. I begin with a question which, in a sense, is both to Shashi and to Kanishk. We live in difficult times, and both their works, I'll specifically be concentrating on an era of darkness because that's been released recently. Both their writings, in a sense, speak about the nation, how we are trying to move beyond the nation, but the nation is also, in very, very curious ways, is tugging on our sleeves. Sometimes in a dangerous way, sometimes not in a very obvious manner. What do you think is the function of writing, of literature, in this age of a resurgence of nationalism?
Well, first of all, great to see you all here. I'm amazed at the turnout at this lovely beach. Good to see some old friends and some new ones as well. Just to say that about Meena's comment that he doesn't need the Tharoor legacy, let me tell you, he's burnishing the Tharoor legacy. I'm very proud that the Tharoor legacy is safer in his hands than in mine. But having said that, I do think that Meena's question is particularly pertinent on these days. Just this morning in our discussion on the future of democracy in the other auditorium, we were talking about precisely this dangerous conflation of loyalty to the government with patriotism, and somehow the word nationalism is used to justify everything there. I've always felt that literature privileges the individual voice, and that what is the strength of literature is that it brings the individual creative artist sensibility to questions that presumably matter to more than just himself, or no one will be reading him, but at the same time speak fundamentally for the one voice that is writing. So because literature privileges the individual voice, it has very often been a far better instrument of subversion than of nationalism. Think of the role of literature in pretty much any tyrannical society that you can imagine, any autocracy. And the writers who have survived, who have won admiration, have invariably been the dissenters, the subversives, the ones challenging the order. There's a famous old metaphor of the writer as the parrot in the cage that used to be sent down the mine shafts in the old days to see if there was enough oxygen down below for the miners to breathe. The writer serves that function, because if the parrot can't breathe and dies, and the cage comes up and the parrot is either gasping for air or has perished, then people know the mine is not safe. And if the writer is gasping or choking or unable to breathe, or worse still, is persecuted, jailed, hanged, and so on, then you know there is something radically wrong with the society. So that in many ways, literature serves that purpose. Of course, literature has been used by some to advocate a certain uniform notion of nationalism. But to my mind, that kind of literature very rarely endures. Now, the only footnote I would add, Meena, is I'm not talking about my own book, which is not a work of literature. My newest book, An Era of Darkness, is a non-fiction book, but rather about things like the Great Indian Novel or my early attempts at fiction, in which I was very conscious of the fact that while presuming to tell a national story, I was doing it very much in a singular voice. And I would always tell people I'm telling an Indian story, that there are other Indian stories and other Indians to tell them.
How would you like to respond to that?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a pleasure to be here. This is my first trip to Calicut, and my wife is here with me, and we're both already falling in love with the city. And we're really glad to have such a wonderful audience here. And to, I can't really think of a better place to talk about books and about the world and nationalism than with the breeze from the Arabian Sea coming into this tent, which has brought with it all sorts of other influences and trade and religions from around the world. And you asked a question about, in the age of resurgent nationalism, what is the function of literature? And it made me think that I grew up reading fiction and mythology and poetry, in large part because I was interested in the world far away from me. So, and this is in small part a function of my upbringing, where both my parents filled our house with books, and books from all over the place. So my mother, when we were young, would read to us from the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, just as much as she might read to us from the collection of Bengali folk tales. For me growing up, I really did feel that part of the function of reading was journeying to other places. I read not to see myself reflected in the fiction or the mythology or the epic or whatever that I was reading. I wanted to learn about other places. And I don't think that's necessarily the only way to think about literature. A lot of people write to explore the self, to excavate the sense of the nation. But for me, it was really always a journey elsewhere. And in my writing of fiction, I think I've also tried to channel that interest. That, the point for me of reading and for writing is engaging worlds sort of away from me and often outside the bounds of the nation.
It's interesting, Kanishk, that you mentioned that, because when I read your book, this is the feel I got, that here is a flaneur. He's a loiterer of the world, and I think all global spaces and even interstellar spaces are yours, Kanishk. But what is very interesting about your writing is, you are still very rooted in the national, right? You don't want to float free of the national. While Kanishka's writing, in a sense, is post-national. Would you like to respond to that?
You're totally correct, because I think Kanishk is in fact writing very much a 21st century sensibility. His books, if you look at the short stories in Swimmer Among the Stars, there's one set in a medieval Central Asian kingdom unnamed, just before it's invaded by the barbarians. If you read another story, it's the United Nations meeting in space, because the world is drowning in global warming. A third story is clearly set in the present day about refugees fleeing an unnamed Middle Eastern country and taking refuge in an unnamed Scandinavian country. Now, each of these show that the author is transcending the concerns of time, of space, of geography, and of allegiance, except perhaps the allegiance that he has to the written word and to the word as an instrument of conveying something very valuable about the human condition. Whereas in my case, I have written almost entirely and exclusively about India. It may have partially been driven by the fact, I say partially because you're making me think consciously about something I didn't think consciously about at the time, but it may have partially been driven by the fact that I was already working for the United Nations from the age of 22. I was in a situation where I could take the world for granted, but I didn't want to lose my own country. And so writing and reading became a way of scratching the itch that was India in my psyche. And as a result, my books became very much an exploration of the forces that have made India and nearly unmade it, whether in my fiction or my non-fiction. I was keeping on looking at different aspects of Indian experience and Indian life. To my mind, I mean, I have certainly no apology to make for that, because that was what mattered to me. But to my mind, the question of whether I was doing it in a sort of different spirit from Kanishk almost doesn't apply. No, I mean, it's just that for me, this was what I wanted to write about. I was away from it. I cared about it. I kept up passionately, almost obsessively, with what was going on in India. And so that was what I chose to write about.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because Kanishk told me that he still is Indian. His passport is, he still has an Indian passport. So how do you respond to that, that description of you as a flaneur of the world?
I don't think it's, this mic is on. I don't think that's entirely inaccurate a description. Again, my own life experience, I don't take as representative of a wider sort of social phenomenon. I don't think I'm indicative of some kind of historical geopolitical change or anything. It was quite specific. We grew up in a UN-related family in New York City, and that we went to a UN school, and that gave us the freedom, especially because we were surrounded by others who were like that, to feel comfortably belonging in New York without feeling anxious or uncertain about our own identities. I never had the experience of that dislocation of diaspora, of worrying that, oh, am I Indian, am I American, am I neither? It felt comfortable for us to think that we were Indians living in New York. And part of that function is that I think I have a twin brother, Ishan. Both Ishan and I were raised in such a way that we could switch frames of reference pretty easily. So, we were schooled in Indian history and politics and culture, so when we traveled to India, we didn't feel dislocated there. And we just switched into a different frame of reference. And maybe that's a little bit, I also feel I can do that for a few other places because of my own studies and travels. And maybe that's a little bit in what you see in terms of my loitering around the world. I suppose I don't necessarily, when I go somewhere else or I think about another place, I'm not interested in its foreignness, so to speak. I feel like I can switch into its own context. So I think one of the things I was trying to achieve with this book of short stories, in part because this is how my imagination works, is that for anybody reading in English, or as it were in Malayalam now, there's a Malayalam edition, there will soon be a French edition, that it's not written for a particular national audience. So I think anybody who reads these stories will be as disoriented and as familiar with the themes they're writing. And that's a tricky thing to do. I think most writers of fiction often have a sense of a clearly demarcated national audience. I don't, and it's something that I think is exciting, but it's also something I struggle with as a writer, and putting my work into the world.
Does it limit your writing?
I don't know if it limits my writing. It may limit the reception of my writing, but I don't think it limits my writing. But I think it is. My book is coming out in the US and the UK in a few months, and I'm very curious to see how my book is received there. In part, I think my book was received very generously last year when it came out in India, and I think part of the reason for that is that Indians are omnivorous readers. Indians are used to reading literature and other things that come from elsewhere. They're used to stepping out of themselves when it comes to writing, when it comes to many other kinds of, including sports. So I'm curious, and I don't think Americans are the same way. I think Americans are more used to seeing themselves reflected in the world of fiction they consume. So I'm interested to see how my book is received there.
It's very interesting you say that, because if you look at this book, Swimmer Among the Stars, I'm very interested in knowing how the British audience would, look at it, because Kanishk is actually using a technique which is ancient. It was there in Old English poetry. It was there in Norse poetry. I'm sure Professor Sachidanandan would know about this. It's called kenning, where you do not actually speak of a word, but instead of a word, you have a figurative kind of a description. And that, I think, is the forte of your language. You're brilliant, as far as your verbal artifice goes. I love his language more than I love your language. But that brings me to another question. When I said that you were rooted in the national, I nevertheless meant that you did. I still remember at that point of time you were the most cosmopolitan of writers. So how do you speak about literary cosmopolitanism, the need for literary cosmopolitanism in the sea?
Well, it's a tough one. I mean, I never thought of myself particularly as being a cosmopolitan writer, in that I had the experience that so many others, frankly, certainly in my generation in urban India had, of hailing from one part of the country, studying in a second part, working in a third part, that kind of thing. I mean, my college friend Ram Guha is sitting here. He's from Bangalore, he studied at St. Stephen's, Delhi. I think he went and did his first job in Calcutta. I mean, this is not untypical of a certain urban, educated Indian experience. And yes, it is cosmopolitan, but it is effortlessly cosmopolitan. We didn't seek to be cosmopolitan. The circumstances of life for a certain segment of Indian society made that possible. My father migrated from a village in Palakkad district to London in 1948. I was born in England. Then he came back because he had never intended to be a migrant. He went off to London very much the way in which other Malayali boys went off to Bombay or Calcutta or Delhi to seek their futures. So he came back to live in Bombay, so I went to school in Bombay. He got promoted and transferred to Calcutta, so I went to high school in Calcutta. Then Calcutta was going through various kinds of Naxalite troubles and other things in the university, so I went off to study on my own in Delhi. But as a result, I have a very much a pan-Indian view of India, and my entire sensibility is one that refuses to be rooted in one particular place. Yes, my parents made me very conscious that I'm Malayali. Every year we come back, not just to Kerala, but to their ancestral villages. We spend very little time in Trivandrum or Cochin or Kozhikode. It was always in the villages of my parents' parents that we spent our holidays. So I definitely grew up with a sense of all that as part of my heritage. My father was a very gifted practitioner of Autumn. So that kind of thing I had watched from my childhood. But Kerala is a place where my cousins growing up in the village were reading Satra and Camus in Malayalam. They were performing Shakespeare plays in Malayalam in their primary school. And so a lot of, and I first came across the story of Merchant of Venice, not in my classroom in Bombay, but as a small child watching my cousins performing it in Malayalam in the village of Elementary in Palakkad district. So I would argue that there is a lot of cosmopolitanism anyway in India without even the geographical moving about. And that goes back to Kanish's point that Indians are used to reading about from other parts of the world. I think that's very true. One would argue that Khasakin Itihasam, for example, by Homi Vijayan, was arguably the first magic realist novel because it preceded 100 Years of Solitude by a few years. And now the question is that if this kind of literary experimentation is not cosmopolitan, what is it? It is. Even if it's rooted in not just one country, but one language and one part of one country.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I still remember when, on the cusp of the change, when Rajiv Gandhi would come into power, you wrote a newspaper article on cosmopolitanism and politics. Do you remember that? You don't?
Not anymore. I've been too prolific for my own good.
So a cosmopolitan
and that's
writer.
the pre-computer days, so I haven't got it saved in the memory.
I just wanted to say that, we also shouldn't just think of cosmopolitanism as reading Shakespeare, I think it's so often, I think one of the problems with the word cosmopolitanism is the extent to which it gets associated with either an urban or foreign elite, Western elite. I think one of the amazing things about India is how naturally cosmopolitan it is at every level of society. And I think Kerala is a great example of that. I think it's very easy to just see the intrinsic cosmopolitans of Kerala just going down the road and seeing the mosque next to the church, next to the temple. And I think, you know, I don't want to let cosmopolitanism become some kind of elite, liberal, urban goal. I think it's just a more fundamental thing. And I think it goes back to your question about nationalism and resurgent nationalism, because the resurgent nationalism you're talking about these days, both in India or Turkey or in the US and in East and in Europe, figures as its enemy cosmopolitanism of the elites. So I think, you know, for those of us who are worried about this trend, we have to remember that there is that the multitude of identity and senses of belonging isn't something that just accrues at the very top, but it's more fundamental.
In 1989, when the great Indian novel was published, in a sense it launched 1,000 irreverences into Indian writing and Indian reading of literatures. It dislodged the grand narrative of mythology that we'd often thought about. But an era of darkness, 2016, speaks about another kind of a dislodgement. It dislodges the grand narrative of history. When did you begin working on that? How did that idea come to you?
Well, the literal answer is not very long ago, because it got sparked off by a speech I made at the Oxford Union in the summer of 2015, which, when it was posted on YouTube, went viral. And then my publisher, a very good friend, David Arda, who, by the way, had been my publisher when the great Indian novel was published, he said to me, "You've got to write a book." And I said, "This is silly, doesn't everyone know this?" To which his answer was, "No, everyone doesn't know it, because if they did, your speech wouldn't have gone viral." And that got me thinking, and I said, all right, maybe it would be useful to put down in book form the core argument. Though, of course, I had to do additional research to buttress it. But my view had already been formed a long time back, going back, I would argue, to my high school days. Now, the question is, so if I just wrote it between July of 2015 and now, you know, how much has gone into it, so when did it begin? I'm actually reminded of a true story when I was in Singapore many, many years ago with the UN. And I was invited to a demonstration by a Chinese brushwork painter. And the Chinese brushwork painter unrolled a scroll, took out his paints, and did these magnificent sort of, you know, swirls with his brush. And at the end of it all, in 3 minutes, his painting was done. And he held it up and said, $25,000. So one of the ladies there gasped and said, $25,000 for 3 minutes? And he looked at her and said, 3 minutes, madam, and 35 years. In other words, to know how to do that in 3 minutes, there was a 35 years of experience and learning behind it. And that, to my mind, is, I suppose, my somewhat defensive answer to the speed with which I wrote this book. Yes, it is written in a relatively short time, but at the same time it draws from very many years of reading into the subject, not in an as organized and systematic and scholarly a way as the book demands, but out of genuine passion and interest. I mean, I was this kind of crazy kid in high school who, in addition to my schoolwork and required reading, would write my own history essays, going to the library and looking at books which actually the teacher had not prescribed. And the essays were written for myself, they weren't given to the teacher to correct. They were just for my own satisfaction, because the subject engaged me so much, and particularly modern Indian history. So that's why, and by the way, some relative has come across that notebook of mine from when I was 14 and sent it to me, and it isn't as bad as it suggests it should be. So the truth is that engagement really does go back more than 4 decades.
It's it's not a book of history, rather I would call it a book of historiography, where you're looking at the histories that have been written about the colonial era. But it's also interesting because when you speak about a certain correction of history, how do you rectify something that happened in the past? Say, for example, Trudeau apologizing to in the House of Commons in Canada for the Komagata Maru incident, or Kevin Rudd apologizing to the Aborigines. Do you think an apology of that kind, or some kind of a token, gesture, would rectify centuries of,
Well, rectify may be the wrong word. What I'm looking for is atonement. Because the truth is that this debate was about reparations, and I only got into it because that was the topic assigned. I don't really believe very much in the feasibility of reparations, because I think even trying to quantify the enormous damage done by 200 years of British rule would be a futile exercise. Any payable sum would not be credible, and any credible sum would not be payable. So why get into what is a fit for reparations? But atonement can come in a very different way, and that is through the actual process of acknowledging to themselves a wrong done. Right now there is a very convenient historical amnesia in Britain. The week my book came out, a Pakistani journalist whom I don't know wrote an article in The Guardian talking about how she had raised 2 children in the best public school, which, as you know, is a private school in London, Westminster. They had majored in history and they had not learned a line of colonial history. The British prefer to brush all this under the carpet. So London is full of magnificent buildings, but who paid for them is essentially concealed from the people. This is where the British, unfortunately, I believe, are doing themselves a serious disservice, because they simply don't know. All they see is of these gauzy, sort of rose-tinted, romanticized dramas like Indian Summers or the Far Pavilions on their television screens. That's all they know about empire, and as far as the atrocities and so on, complete ignorance. So I feel an apology would go a long way. I feel that you look back at Willy Brandt, who was the Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany in the early 1970s, sinking to his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto and apologizing to the Polish people for the atrocities of the Nazis. Now, he's a social democrat. He's completely free of any taint of what the Nazis had done. In fact, social democrats like him were persecuted by the Nazis. But as head of the German government, he felt it was necessary to convey that sense of regret on behalf of his people. Similarly, you mentioned the Trudeau example. The Komagata Maru was a Japanese ship with a lot of Indians on it. It was turned away by the Vancouver port. And many, in fact, pretty much everybody on that ship met a grisly end either on the high seas or at British hands. So the Canadians didn't directly kill anybody, they were indirectly responsible for their deaths. Still, on the centenary of Komagata Maru, we chose to apologize to the Indian people. So wouldn't it be wonderful if, say, on the centenary of Jallianwala Bagh, which in many ways is a symbol of the worst atrocity of the British Raj, that you could actually have a member of the royal family or a member of the government, ideally the Prime Minister, coming to Jallianwala Bagh and sinking to their knees and begging forgiveness from the Indian people. It would be, I think, at the very least cleansing, and perhaps it would oblige the British people to look into themselves and ask what it was they had done that requires this atonement.
But Kanishk, I'm going to accuse him of something now. If I say that there's a reverse kind of a racism in your book, would you agree with me there? Because, see, for example, one of my favorite books is The Heart of Darkness. You also speak of another kind of darkness. The Heart of Darkness speaks about the brutalization of Africa. And people like Chinua Achebe, for example, have accused Conrad of being a racist. So, in your book, if I see strands of a reverse racism, do you agree with me there?
Not at all, because racism is too glib and simple a word to describe what we are doing in response to what they did. I mean, I mentioned Jallianwala Bagh, and let's just take it. You've got a large number of innocent men, women and children gathering to commemorate Baisakhi in a garden. Now, they don't know that Section 144 has been declared. They don't know they're not supposed to be in groups of more than 5. It's Baisakhi Day, for God's sake, so they come. And this fellow Dyer opens fire without a single warning without any order to disperse, without even a warning shot fired in the air. He orders his troops to fire directly into the bodies, and he positions them near the only gate of the bar, so that as they come, he says they were easier targets. He actually said that. Practically no bullet was quote-unquote wasted. Hundreds of people were killed. There's some unnecessary dispute about the numbers. Hundreds more grotesquely wounded. Many were children. It was just really criminal. Then what does he do? He prohibits any access to the wounded, the dead and the dying for 24 hours. There were people who died after the massacre because they could not be tended to. Not even water could be given. They're mourning piteously, and the gate is shut and Indians are not allowed to go in. Indians are made to crawl on their bellies in a neighboring street. And if they so much as raise their heads, they're bashed with staves, with lathis. Then you end up in a situation where for a month afterwards, every day, every able-bodied young man from the age of 12 or 13 upwards is made to come and assemble the public square, stripped and humiliated. After all of this, the British actually had the gall to raise funds to reward Dyer for what he had done. The equivalent of £250,000 in today's money. And Rudyard Kipling, that flatulent voice of imperialism, hailed him as the man who saved India. Now, to my mind, this completely encapsulates everything that was wrong. It was the brutality, the viciousness, the complete lack of respect for Indian lives, the dehumanization of the subject people, the oppression and mistreatment, the gratuitous cruelty, and then on top of that, the vindication, self-congratulation, and celebration of the wrong that had been done. Now, asking someone to come and say a simple sorry is not the reverse of that.
I would like to bring in Kanishk here because the stories in your collection in some ways is an answer to many of the questions that he is raising in an era of darkness. Because I would say that looking back today, India was not conquered by brute force. India was also conquered by a language. India was conquered by the English language, and the legacies continue, the legacies of atrocities and things like that. In a sense, all three of us, and not exempting myself, all three of us form the latest, entrance into that kind of a legacy. You have a story in your collection which is titled Swimmer Among the Stars, which talks about the last speaker of a language. And you begin with a rule, right? Do you remember the rule?
That the last speaker of a language doesn't speak it.
Doesn't speak it. The last speaker of a language never speaks the language. The last speaker speaks some other language. So how do you respond to the question that I raised?
Well, yeah, so we were raised my brother and I were raised in a very anti-imperial household, so to speak. I think many of the arguments in my father's book, whether or not as specifically as he lays them out, were always there in our household, around the dining table, in conversations. And I have to say, curiously, growing up in New York, one of the ways I most intensely felt my Indianness, actually, was encountering the level of ignorance about the history of empire and colonialism that many in the West have. And often I would feel, I would feel in many ways that I belonged to a world that the dominant narrative didn't include. And that's one of the many great contributions of my father's book, is a wonderful synthesis of a narrative that I think not only Indians should know, but people elsewhere should know. So this is to say that I have always been interested in what's suppressed or what's excluded from the dominant narrative. And I think many of my stories, and not just the one you mentioned in the collection, are responding to that, are curious about the sort of nooks and crannies of history that we don't often think about. Now, the story you mentioned, the title story, Swimmer Among the Stars, is it's about an interview between anthropologists and the supposed last speaker of a language. It's a subject that, I think as somebody who reads and writes and unfortunately also thinks in English, it behooves us to think about. We live in an unprecedented era of language extinction. 50% of the world's languages have died in the last century. And more are set to die soon. And so as somebody who is a representative of this linguistic empire riding roughshod over the world, I did feel it was incumbent upon me to look into this. It's also, to be more precise, it's a question that has interested me in part because the city I live in, New York City, over 800 languages are spoken just in New York City. And many of those languages are in fact endangered languages. That is to say, they're no longer spoken in places like Kenya or Bangladesh or Indonesia, but are still spoken in the suburbs of New York City or Queens and other parts of the area. And so there are anthropologists gathering the remnants of these languages in New York, because if they went into the field, so to speak, in these other countries, they would not find them there. And so I have a friend who's involved in this work, and as a result, I got interested in the question of language extinction, and read a lot about it and did some work on it, and that story came out of that interest.
I think it's one of the best stories in this collection, and especially relevant to Malayalis today, because at a time when we are agonizing over the death of our language, the almost imminent death sometime in the future, Kanishk has written a story about the last speaker of a language, an old lady, who was the last speaker, and a lot of scientists and anthropologists and ethnographers are there to record her speech, but she hardly can speak much because she's not speaking the language on a regular basis. Right?
I hope though a festival like this has proved to you that Malayalam is not at all a dying language and it's not at all endangered.
For Malayalis to worry about the extinction of their language seems to be utterly paradoxical, because if anything, Malayalam is very much stronger today than it was just a generation ago in terms of every, you look at the proliferation of books, of publishing houses, of literature, of newspapers, of television channels. I mean, come on, I find Malayalam is extremely healthy. In fact, in some ways, the creation of linguistic states has jeopardized other languages in Kerala. I think that English is far more jeopardized in Kerala. I mean, my distinguished predecessor, V.K. Krishnamenon, contested for the Tharoor parliamentary seat in 1971 without speaking a word of Malayalam. All his campaign speeches were in English. If he were alive today and he tried that, he'd lose his deposit, right? It is impossible in Kerala to function today without being absolutely able to hold your own in Malayalam. And in fact, for most people in Kerala, you often don't encounter any other language, which is one of the reasons why it's good that some of you are being forced to hear this conversation in English. Because the honest truth is that you don't normally necessarily feel that you need to hear English at all in the course of a normal day. To my mind, it seems to me that our languages have never been stronger and safer. But these are the dominant languages in each state. There are the smaller tribal languages and so on which are dying out. There is an Indian scholar who's been studying all this, and I think between censuses, we have lost over 200 languages in India between the last census and the 2011 census. So it's really quite alarming.
Poets like Professor Sachidanandan have, been constantly anxious about that. The very famous poem of his titled Vikka, where you're stammering because you're not used to the language. So at some point we're always paranoid that we would stammer if we don't really own our language. To come back to your book, Kanishk, why the short story?
Well, I have to confess that I don't have any particular ideological allegiance to the short story as a form. I'm working on a novel now. These short stories were written over a period of time, some when I was even a teenager, so they were experiments. But at the same time, I do think that the short story as a form allows a kind of adventurousness that is less sustainable, not impossible, but less sustainable in the novel. I think it's easier, as you, for example, either you or my father, forgive me, mentioned a short story about the United Nations having to meet in outer space because Earth is in such a perilous situation. And that is a conceit that I think can stretch the reader's credulity for maybe 30 pages, but might break it for anything longer, for something like 300 pages. So I think there are certain kinds of conceits and playfulness that are enabled or allowed by the short story that the novel just wouldn't sustain.
I think it's a wonderful take, and I do agree with you, and it does allow you the play that makes it all the more delightful. But in Kanishka's stories, I did see a tinge of Borges. I did see Marquez. I did see our own, the Persian tales, for example, our own Kathasagar. So many stories, so many narrative traditions reflected in your stories. So, did you grow up reading all this, or is it something that came?
I did grow up, I think both my parents were very keen to foist Marquez on us when we were about 12 or 13 years old. But beyond that, I think we also were raised with a very eclectic sense of what literature is. It wasn't just novels from the 20th century, it was, as you mentioned, all sorts of folk tales, epics, and myths. And in many ways, I enjoy reading those and get as much out of those as I might out of a realist 20th century novel. I find both those kinds of sources of inspiration quite fruitful. Also, I have to say, I read a lot more in translation than I read in English. And I think that habit of reading in translation, I think, especially in writing short stories, really helped me find my tone and find the shape of my writing. And you mentioned Borges. I am heavily indebted to some of the South American and Southern European writers and some of the traditions that they have emerged out of. So yes, I think also in general, I believe in the power of the pre-modern kind of telling. It's funny that you mentioned Old English. I studied Old English, and I love the rhythms of that language. And I think in many ways what excites me about the pre-modern way of telling is that it often has more to do with the way a story is told than the story itself. And obviously the story matters. And I think as a writer, living in the age of the internet and TV and film, we really have to think about why is the way I am delivering narrative and meaning in the vehicle of prose. Why is this important now when people have so many other ways of receiving narrative? And I think one of that is that there's a joy in the artifice of writing and the artifice of language. And as a writer, I think that's where I take a lot of pleasure.
This is a question I challenge the audience with. Please read this book and see whether you can translate Kanishk. Because as a person who knows both Malayalam and English, some of the stories I think would pose a great dilemma for a translator. So I have a vague feeling that you might feel a little lost in translation, Kanishk.
I hope not. There is a lovely Malayalam edition of the book.
It already exists, the Malayalam edition.
Really?
Yes, BC Books has bought it out in Malayalam.
Who's the translator?
I don't know. Kanishk, do you remember the name of the translator? Is the translator here? No. Anyway, there is a DC Books Malayalam edition of Summer Manasar.
Really? It's already been published?
Already been published, and you should see whether your fears have been hopefully proven groundless.
I wanted to ask you a question. Amongst this collection of stories, there's a story of the United Nations in space. What I also felt was, it's a very interesting story. Why was Luxembourg the only woman in the story?
I have no idea. In fact, Kanishk had his own idiosyncratic decisions for which characters to do what. And, in my pedantic diplomatic way, when he sent me the manuscript, I made some silly comments like, Japan wouldn't do that, or Liechtenstein wouldn't do that, or whatever. And he cheerfully ignored them all and did his own thing. You'll have to ask the author.
All the countries of the world are men. Luxembourg is the only country which is a woman. I was shocked by that.
There are, to be fair, there are a few other women in the story. Botswana is a woman, and Panama is a woman as well.
Generally, there are fewer female ambassadors than us. I remember when Madeleine Albright was ambassador to the UN, she used to have a lunch group of 8, because of 192 countries, there were only 8 women ambassadors. So he wasn't totally off in skewing the balance, to be realistic. But on translation, I should tell you one very interesting experience I had is that my novel, The Great Indian Novel, when it came out, as you know, the title was not only a play on the whole idea of the Great Indian Novel, or the Great American Novel, all of those conceits that exist in literature. It was also because the novel reinvents the Mahabharata as a satirical tale of 20th century India. Maha being great and Bharata being India, the great Indian novel was an allusion to Mahabharata. Now obviously in all the translations into Western languages that was completely lost. Because in English you could say the great Indian novel, it was both the great Indian novel and the novel of great India if you want. Whereas in French or Spanish or whatever, it was a literal translation with the great modifying India, that was that. In Malayalam, I thought they did a very clever translation of the title. And they called it Mahabharata Katha, with Bharata in brackets. Mahabharata Katha, which I thought was incredibly clever because they conveyed simultaneously. There is not a literal translation of Mahabharata, otherwise there is funny bracket, why is there Katha at the end, and the way in which I thought it was rendered, it conveyed some of the hinted playfulness that the book obviously promises with it.
Which is the story you like best in this connection?
It gets very difficult because whenever I'm asked about which of my books I like best and so on, I always respond, that's like asking a father which of his children he likes the best. Because you really do put all of yourself into everything.